Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today I'm interviewing journalist and author Andrew Lawton, who also happens to be a good friend of mine, about his new book, The Freedom Convoy, the inside story of 3 weeks that shook the world. If you're interested in a copy of the book, we are actually giving away a free copy at the ccf.ca/book contest, so check that out. Now, in his book, Andrew combines his own on-the-ground reporting with hours of interviews with Freedom Convoy demonstrators to tell the full story of what happened from start to finish, including the background of the convoy and all the personalities involved. This provides real insight into how over-the-top the government's response of using the Emergencies Act was. While everyone has their own opinion about the convoy, and some may have found it objectionable, the government's response was far worse. This book gives an excellent perspective about why. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's start at the beginning, because I think a lot of people might not know where the convoy originated or how it kind of started, and it's actually an interesting story. So what can you tell me about that?
There were actually a couple of stories. And one of the things that was interesting is that a lot of people in the country who didn't know each other were really in the same place as one another about being fed up with COVID mandates and restrictions, and all sort of came together. But I've traced the main lineage, if you will, of the convoy back to a woman by the name of Bridget Belton, who was a cross-border trucker, not vaccinated against COVID-19, from Wallaceburg, Ontario. And she had been going back and forth across the border without issue throughout the pandemic because truckers as essential workers were exempt from having to do all of these other restrictions like testing and whatnot. And she was getting fed up and increasingly feeling like a second-class citizen in her own country as an unvaccinated woman. And it was in December, before the trucker mandate was announced, interestingly enough, and she had this terrible experience at the border where she wasn't wearing a mask. She has asthma. She's a survivor of domestic abuse. The idea of just covering her face really doesn't sit well with her. And the border officer threatened her with arrest if she didn't put her mask on. This is a woman who's sitting in her truck alone, going through a border crossing like she has, every week, multiple times a week for years. And the whole situation of her, combined with where she was in the pandemic, really just made her feel like she was done. She was at her wit's end. And, it got very dark for her personally. But she eventually rallied, met up with some other people who were involved in this, like Chris Barber, who was one of the more front and center organizers. And they decided they were going to do something about it. And it started with this very loose idea of what became the Freedom Convoy.
So one of the things, as the convoy evolved and ultimately went to Ottawa, one thing that was interesting that I learned from your book, because this wasn't clear in the media reports that I'd originally seen, was that there wasn't really a clear source of leadership in the convoy. Now, there were a number of characters who all kind of had competing claims of leadership, or who stepped in to volunteer in some way and ended up in an organizing role. But it wasn't clear that there was an actual leader of this movement. So what can you tell me about that? Is that the kind of right perception of this movement?
I wouldn't say that there weren't leaders. I think there were leaders, but there wasn't a CEO. There wasn't a president. There wasn't someone who was a leader in the sense of having top-down authority over a hierarchy. And I think the closest you'd find would be Tamara Leach. She ended up being the president of this not-for-profit that was started. But even then, that leadership was over the money and over the bank accounts and over this organization that developed, but it wasn't over the protest as a whole. And I think that's a key distinction, because the media would latch onto the word organizer or leader as though it was meaningful in some very real way. And it was often because they wanted to lambaste the movement by saying, oh, this person's an organizer, and they said this on Twitter once, and that was how it went. But I also think, for the people on the ground, the one thing I learned is that who was in charge didn't really matter to them. There was one guy I interviewed, David Paisley, who was not a name that was as well known as some of the others. And he just showed up. He wasn't taking his orders from anyone. He showed up. If he saw that fuel needed to be moved from one place to another, he helped by picking it up and moving it. And he sort of talked to other people that were in that. And he described it in Jordan Peterson's terms as the hierarchy of competence, where you just talk to other people that seem competent and capable. And then eventually, by the end of it, you've realized who's doing stuff and who's not. And they were on the ground, the organizers, because they were the ones doing the work.
Yeah, so it seemed like this truly was more grassroots than a lot of other movements that we've seen across Canada, that there wasn't a hierarchical structure in place. And I really got that from your book, that sense of that from that book. We've got to go to break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking to author and journalist Andrew Lawton about his new book, The Freedom Convoy, the inside story of 3 weeks that shook the world, which you can actually get a free copy of, enter to win a copy of, by visiting the ccf.ca/book contest. Now, Andrew, when you first arrived in Ottawa, when the convoy arrived in Ottawa, what was the experience like for you when you first got there to report on it?
The best word to describe it is jubilation. And I should say, I mean, we all know now what became of this thing, but it was very unclear what was going to happen that first weekend. We knew that trucks were coming in from every which way, and these few convoys, one from Western Canada, one from Quebec and Eastern Ontario, one from Atlantic Canada. There was one from Southwestern Ontario. But people didn't know how many trucks there were. Even organizers weren't saying, oh, we have, 42 trucks here and 107 trucks here. And anyone who's ever been around downtown Ottawa knows that the city is just not built to withstand hundreds of transport trucks converging on a place. So no one knew what to expect. There was sort of a loose program set up for the first weekend, but that got ripped up pretty much immediately because of the logistical chaos here. But none of that really mattered. The people were just jubilant. This is coming at a time when vaccine passports were in place, I believe, in every jurisdiction in Canada. You had the vaccine mandate for air travel, the vaccine mandate for border crossing, and the mask mandates in place, I believe, nationwide as well. And some other really egregious policies, like Quebec was still mulling this idea of taxing the unvaccinated, had banned the unvaccinated from going to big box stores. And people in Ottawa were living a life that would better fit in with 2019. They weren't wearing their masks. They were doing what they wanted. They weren't bothering with who was vaccinated and who was not. And that was really why I think there was so much joy, because it wasn't even a protest at that point. It was just people trying to live the life that they felt had been robbed of them by governments.
To be clear, that was the people in the protest in Ottawa, not just all people in Ottawa, because, I don't want to brush over the fact that there were people who lived in Ottawa who felt harassed. And that there were elements in the convoy that were frankly disturbing, potentially illegal, with some people who lived in the area complaining not just of the noise, but of verbal harassment that they experienced. So how does that fit into the bigger picture of the convoy? And what can you tell me about what you saw about that kind of thing, and about elements like this in protests more generally? Because this is not a unique part of the convoy. These are things that happen in lots of protests. There will be unsavory elements, but certainly it was a part of this one. So what can you tell me about that?
So the one thing I will point out is that, and it was interesting, when the city of Ottawa, when residents of Ottawa filed a request for an injunction against the horn honking and won that injunction, I asked a bunch of organizers about that, and every single one of them that I spoke to about that said they were secretly relieved when the injunction came, because they were fed up with the honking as well. So I think everyone agreed that the honking was a bit much. I was there for the first weekend initially, and I found the honking much. So I don't think anyone can say that was not disruptive, but that was also dealt with pretty early on. And the protesters and the organizers, such as they were on side with that. I did not witness any altercations between convoy supporters and Ottawa residents that were not fans of the convoy. I'm not saying they didn't exist, because they did. I didn't see any of those that first weekend. And when I went back later on as well, most residents were steering clear of it. But I also think that a lot of these altercations were escalations that were going both ways, and if you'd see some of the videos, you'd see, an Ottawa person would make a snide comment, a convoy supporter would, and certainly not a civil exchange, but it wasn't just an example of this one-on-one assault of someone in the convoy against a resident, from what I have seen. But at the same time, I also think it's important to note that we still, as a society, as a country, need to sort of understand what those limitations are with protest. Because for years, people on the political left have said that protest is meant to disrupt. It's meant to be uncomfortable. And everyone has sort of accepted that. But now when you have a protest coming broadly from the right, people seem to be approaching it differently. And I don't have an answer, and that's a bigger question than my book went into. But I think that is a big part of the discussion that we as Canadians need to figure out an answer to. What are the limits of disruption when you are protesting?
And certainly there are a number of court cases that have dealt with this very issue, especially in the context of the pandemic. It's a complex balancing of rights. But as a committed civil libertarian myself, I believe full-heartedly in the right to protest, the right to demonstrate, and that I also do believe that protests are intended to be disruptive. Now, we've got to go to commercial break, but when we come back, I want to ask you about some of the most popular coverage that you did. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where I'm interviewing author and journalist Andrew Lawton about his new book, The Freedom Convoy. You can enter a contest to win a copy of that book at theccf.ca/book contest. Now, Andrew, I want to ask you about some of the most popular coverage that you did when you were in Ottawa reporting on the convoy. And that was just straight up plain live streams of the protests. Why do you think that coverage in particular was so impactful for people?
Yeah, it was interesting. I had been working too hard at first, I think, by trying to, do really in-depth journalism when a lot of people just wanted to see it. And I think there were two reasons for that, Christine. The first was that there were a lot of people that couldn't be there that really wanted to be a part of it. They just wanted to feel like they were on the ground, get a sense of this thing that was giving a lot of Canadians that have been in a very dark place because of pandemic restrictions a little bit of hope and community. And community was key. The second part, and I think this is the more interesting aspect of it, there was such distrust for mainstream media coverage that people just didn't trust that what they were seeing on the news was an accurate reflection of it, that this might just be a 30-second clip out of something that makes this person look bad, but what happened around it. So I think people just wanted to see for themselves the unfiltered, unbridled, unannotated version of what was happening on the ground. And I mean, anyone who's ever tried to use their cell phone in minus 20-degree weather knows the battery drains quickly. So had to keep recharging, going back to the hotel, going back out. But just walking around with a Periscope, or not Periscope anymore, but a Twitter live stream was really what people wanted.
Let's talk about the money that was involved in the convoy. There was a huge amount of money that was first donated through GoFundMe. What happened to that money? Was it withdrawn to use to fund the convoy? What was it used for? Who withdrew it? Who was in charge of accessing that money? What can you tell me about that?
So almost all of the donations that people were paying attention to, the ones that were public in nature, didn't make it to the protesters. And the GoFundMe raised about $10 million. The first million of that was released into a TD bank account, as well as some direct e-transfers that were sent there. But TD actually unilaterally froze that money very early on, and their excuse was something about fraud prevention. And the organizers had only pulled out, I think it was about $36,000 of that, which went to fuel. And the rest of it, as we know, when GoFundMe canceled the account, was refunded eventually to donors. So organizers pivoted to Give, Send, Go, which is an American online crowdfunding site. And they raised in a fraction of the time the same amount. I think it was about 10.5 million Canadians, so roughly the same. And then the Ontario government got a secret court order behind closed doors to freeze, to basically prohibit any handling of that money. You couldn't have it, you couldn't spend it, you couldn't use it. And once that happened, it became virtually impossible to get money from the US into Canada without it being frozen. So ultimately, Give, Send, Go ended up refunding donors as well. And there were some workarounds to that. Cash was huge. People would just bring cash, large amounts of cash all day, every day. They'd send it up. Some people would donate $10. Some people would bring thousands. And then there was also a small...
Sorry, who was in charge of handling this cash and deciding how it would be, distributed to people involved in the protests?
Well, and that's where you get into this not-for-profit that was set up that Tamara Leach ran and that some of the road captains were involved in. And they had their own system, and they had, by their account, quite detailed accounting records of it. But they had cash counting machines. They were putting stuff in envelopes. They were delivering envelopes to trucks. But they also had, and the book describes this in fair detail, a really, really complex and sophisticated way of getting fuel, where they were buying it directly from a bulk fuel distributor who was dropping it off at 2 scheduled deliveries a day. Then they would transfer it from a tanker to these slip trucks, which would go up and down the streets and refuel the trucks that needed diesel. And they were doing this by paying directly. So a lot of the money went to fuel. But also a lot of the other things people would bring directly. People would bring food. People would bring clothing. People would pay for hotel rooms. So the money was not as much the lifeblood of this protest as the government and media thought it was.
Especially since a lot of the money never ultimately made its way into the hands of the protesters. Because
most of it didn't.
And the Give, Send, Go money, that was also refunded, right? It was never distributed.
Yeah, and there's been some media coverage that has raised some doubt about that. Give, Send, Go claims it refunded basically all of it because they were worried that the Canadian government was going to work with the U.S. government to seize that money. So they tried to get it back into the donors' hands when they realized that there was no way they were going to get that into Canada to the actual places that it was donated to.
Now, we've got to go to break, but when we come back, I want to talk about how all of this ended, because there's a pretty dramatic story of something that happened to you as well. We will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where I'm interviewing author and journalist Andrew Lawton about his book, The Freedom Convoy. Enter our contest to win a free copy at the ccf.ca/book contest. Now let's talk about the end of the convoy. There actually was a time where the ad hoc leadership worked with police and the city to try and clear some areas, in particular Sussex Street, which is just the east of Parliament. So what happened there? And why did some parts of the organizers want to work with police and the city? And ultimately, how did that go?
This was fascinating. And if people haven't read the book, there was a great excerpt, I think it was great anyway, in The Line that talked about the police negotiations that were going on. And we're actually quite far along when the Emergencies Act came into play. And there was a process underway to move trucks onto Wellington Street, which is that main stretch in front of Parliament Hill, and all the ones that wouldn't fit on there to actually move them out of the city. And organizers and the city of Ottawa in their back channel negotiations had agreed to this and were on the second day of a 3-day process to make this happen. There was one incident, I think the one you're referring to on Sussex, where this shows the grassroots momentum. The police had agreed with the protesters that they would move the trucks off of this one intersection in front of the Chateau Laurier, and they would let them get onto Wellington Street. And they had agreed to do it. They had police on hand, lawyers. Tamara Leach was there. They got the truckers involved because they couldn't force them to do it. They had to convince them. And then police brought in a front-end loader to remove the barricades so that the trucks could move on to Wellington Street. And when the protesters saw this, they thought that the police were moving in to basically to crack heads and make this protest end. So protesters surrounded the front end loader, and about 1,000 of them showed up within a couple of hours and started singing "Oh Canada." And eventually they just had to abort the operation because there was no way they could do it, because the people were just so motivated to make sure that this thing stayed around.
Now, ultimately, the police did end up moving in once the Emergencies Act was declared to clear out Wellington Street. And as that was happening, you were standing reporting on this actually quite far back from where it was happening. But you ultimately got pepper sprayed by police while you were there reporting as a journalist. What can you tell me about what happened there?
Yeah, it was quite actually a bizarre experience, because this was right in front of the Chateau Laurier and I was off to the side, and police had been all morning moving forward fairly slowly, a few feet at a time. And this was actually at the exact moment that the horse we've seen in that footage, the horses ran forward and an older woman was trampled and knocked over. And police had started moving at this point very aggressively forward, and they were moving so quickly forward that it was actually quite difficult difficult to safely get back at the same pace that they were advancing. And police, who had been also keeping a fairly solid straight line as they advanced, ended up breaking their formation and shoving people to the sides. And I was caught up in that. And I was actually pushed up against a barrier where I didn't really have anywhere to go. Even then, I was still a little bit of a distance away from the front line, and police pepper sprayed indiscriminately, it seems. And I got a very large dose too. I mean, one eye got hit really badly, but both eyes did get hit. And I saw a photo that a journalist took in the moments after that, and it looks like police missed. It looked like they were aiming at a guy that was right near them, but these things have a very long range, which is why a lot of civil liberties groups have been so critical of the use of chemical irritants, as they call it, in these contexts.
And how much did that hurt? Just curious. I've never been pepper sprayed. I never thought
when I go to doctors, I'm bad with like scale of 1 to 10 questions, but it hurt. And the big problem was that because I was out covering this, I didn't have the ability to properly rinse it out. So it actually stayed on for a couple of hours, which is ill-advised. And I ended up having to go to the hospital later on on advice from a healthcare practitioner. But I ended up being fine. So
I'm glad you are, and I'm glad that you had the chance to write this book. It's such an interesting insight into everything that happened, the full perspective. Andrew Lawton, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Christine. Always a pleasure.
We've heard today from author and journalist Andrew Lawton and about his new best-selling book, The Freedom Convoy. Now, I have my own opinions about the convoy, and not all of them are positive. It did have illegal elements. But protests are designed to be disruptive. And the government also broke the law by invoking the Emergencies Act. Now, what do you think? Will you be reading Andrew's book to understand the whole story? Sign up for our book contest at theccf.ca/book contest or purchase it yourself online. Then you be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.